You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Sometimes that shark looks right at you, right into your eyes. You don't think about a shark, you see. Lifeless eyes, black eyes, like a doll's eyes. He comes at you, doesn't seem to be living until he bites you. Black eyes roll over white and then...
Hey, everybody. You're listening to and possibly watching the Comic Book Bears podcast. I'm Bill Zanowitz.
And I'm Steve Mowry.
And we are your hairy, heavy homos that talk about comic books, but you don't have to be a hairy, heavy homo to listen in or possibly stream in. And what we have for you tonight is a very different episode, but it's going to be the first of many episodes of its type because my co-host, cohort, and co-conspirator, Stephen Mowry, is going to be hosting his own podcast called The Bear Cave of Terror. So what happened with our third wheel, Caleb Alexander McKenzie, and our good friend Brian Newberry, who is in town in Arkansas with Caleb, we wanted to make sure that they had some time together because I think this was the only opportunity they had to get together during Brian's trip. So they're hanging out. And they left us alone. And in doing that, though, again, Steve's preparing this new podcast. So we figured, hey, let's just do a backdoor pilot for it. And, God knows I can talk about horror films, too. And since we are experiencing right now the summer of the 50th anniversary of Jaws, let's talk some Jaws.
Absolutely. And, this is definitely like the perfect week for it as well, because this happens to also be Shark Week. So that the time that we're actually recording this.
Or if you're a big Marvel fan, Jeff Week.
Jeff Week, absolutely. It's Jeff. Jeffy's also back here. It's Jeff. But yeah, thanks so much, Bill. Yeah, Caleb and Brian, we hope you're having a great time at getting Indian tonight and then hanging out and painting the town red or pink or whatever. So we will miss you, but we'll be talking about Jaws. And like Bill said, we're going to kind of do this as a little bit of a backdoor pilot, or a butt pilot, if you will, as he hangs his head in shame. But yeah, so basically, if you've watched a lot of sitcoms in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s, there was the concept of a backdoor pilot where, some interesting neighbors would flit in through the door.
They still happen. I mean, look on Arrow. The Arrowverse had two of them at least, with Killmonger or not Killmonger. Ash was kind of had one. The
Birds of Prey.
The Green Arrow and the Canaries, or whatever that was called.
That's what it was. Yeah, Green Arrow and the Canaries.
And then whatever. I can't think of the character's name. I said Killmonger, and it's not that. That's the other side. Yeah.
Well, technically, I think Superman and Lois, maybe, or that probably was more in Supergirl, where you had that where Tyler Hoechlin kind of made his appearance for the first time as Superman. But I mean, comic books are full of them. You introduce a character or a concept, and then suddenly there's a spin-off miniseries or a whole other series. And interestingly enough, with Jaws, didn't necessarily have that, but you definitely had a lot of imitators trying to get that same formula going and the same success. Didn't really work, but there are some really cool ones, and we'll talk about those, I think, a little bit later.
I corrected myself now. Painkiller was a backdoor pilot on Black Lightning. Yeah.
Painkiller, yes. Yep. I do remember that.
Now, Steve, before we get started, all right, I'm putting you on the interviewee seat right now.
Ooh.
Why the Bear Cave of Terror?
Why the Bear Cave of Terror? Well, bears, and bears live in caves, and caves can be kind of scary.
That's a shitty answer. Keep going.
It is. So, why am I doing this podcast? Basically, it's kind of my second nerdy side has been very much a horror fan all my life since I was a little kid. Huge horror fan. It started when I was probably, I don't know, 7, 8 years old, reading Stephen King for the first time, and then realizing that there were actually movies based on his books. I also had a lot of cool babysitters that like to bring in horror movies to watch on VHS. Don't tell your parents, it's a little too scary. If it's too scary for you, you're going to have to go to bed, that kind of thing. And then, of course, when we finally got cable, I got introduced to, first off, Mystery Science Theater 3000. So getting a lot of really bad horror movies with a lot of humor attached to it with the riffing. But also got to see USA Up All Night. And USA Up All Night was an absolute revelation. Friday and Saturday nights getting all the franchise hits, the Nightmare on Elm Streets, the Friday the 13th, all the other Full Moon Entertainments before, I guess before they got really popular. So a lot of the Puppet Masters and things like that first hit there. But also, even just watching Saturday Matinee when I was a little kid in Pennsylvania, one of the local stations would always show 1950s and 1960s horror movies, the creature features, Tarantula, It Conquered the World, Them, these kinds of big monster movies. That also led me to go and check out all the Universal horror monster movies, Dracula, and Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, The Wolfman, Invisible Man, and, just so much. And of course, over the years, I've been seeing a lot of, diverse genres. I really love Italian horror masters. I've been really loving a lot of the straight-to-video horror schlock from the 80s, 90s, and the 2000s. You can always love anything that Romero does and any kind of, a zombie spin-off from that or homage or rip-off, if you will. But yeah, there's so much great horror out there. There's some terrible horror, but there's some really great horror out there that people absolutely love. And, one of the big things that I love to do is I love to talk about things that just, really make me happy. And I like to hear about other people and what other people have to say about things that make them happy. So combining the two, horror movies and things that make people happy, I get to hear other horror fans gush about their favorite films or their favorite genres and tell me, and of course the listener, why they love what they love, and hopefully learn a couple things about those movies at the same time. So some behind the scenes information, some trivia, some cool stuff about the director, the actors, or even the story, just to kind of enhance the experience of learning about a film that maybe you've seen a million times, or maybe you've never seen, didn't know if you wanted to, or something you never thought about seeing, especially when it comes to horror. There's so many different subgenres, or so many things that people, gravitate towards or away from, but there's something for everybody, and I want to hear all about it.
Okay, so with your show, you assume with the way you've been talking about it, that it's going to be very guest-heavy.
Yes. And in fact, it's basically every episode I'm inviting on a different guest host to talk about a particular movie that just brings them joy. Horror joy is full of scares, frights, gore, or just something that's really interesting and scratches an itch that they love to tell other people about. Yeah, I just kind of want to hear more about that and maybe encourage other people to check that movie out, or maybe rewatch something that they haven't seen for a long time.
Okay, I get you.
But yeah, so of course tonight, this is a backdoor pilot, so I didn't necessarily invite you onto my show. We're just doing it all together. But the movie that you're here to talk about is, of course, Jaws. What about Jaws do you love? What is it about Jaws?
So with me and Jaws, I saw it in its original theatrical run. I saw it the summer of 75. I was 8 years old, and I was a pretty mature 8-year-old that my parents didn't think I'd, go nuts with nightmares. Jaws was only the third or fourth movie I ever saw in the movie theater. I remember seeing Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. This is a bunch here. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs reissue, Escape to Witch Mountain, and then either Gus, which is a movie about a horse that plays football. It was a Disney film, and Jaws. So not a lot of consistent lead up to Jaws. in the summer. And as a theatrical experience, for that to be so early on, that because I think the thing about Jaws, and I apologize, my New Jersey's going to come out so bad with Jaws. I apologize for that. I can feel it though. The thing with what I felt with Jaws is that was the first time I felt it was a shared experience with the other members of the audience, with getting startled at the same time, with getting, the anxiety building because of the music or because of another situation that was being played out on camera. So there's a lot of affection there. And it's a movie I always watch at least once every summer. And my favorite viewing experience of Jaws, and I don't know why they put the kibosh on this, and I wish they would do this again. At Asbury Park, they had a screening on the beach. And let me tell you, it was the kind of thing where as the tide was coming in and the water was just getting a little bit closer to us, and it even went beyond the screen at one point, that added to it. It really did. And it was
that just sounds really cool.
Oh, it was so great. And I know with this anniversary year that in late August, Fathom Events has a few of the screenings, and I think they're in like a treated IMAX or something. I'm not exactly sure. At the very least, it's a 4K version of the film, and I think I'm probably headed there. I did rewatch it earlier this month. And I think that maybe for this summer once isn't enough.
Well, I hadn't watched it myself for years, and I watched it in preparation for this and saw the best quality version that I could get off of Netflix, because it is available pretty much on most.
Well, especially in July, especially in July, because it coincides with the Shark Week events. I know that for at least 2 years, Tubi had it for free. I think right now the main streamer is Peacock because of the Universal situation, but I don't think it's necessarily limited to Peacock. If I'm wrong, I think it is on Netflix, and I think it might be on Prime Video as well.
I think so. I think you're right. It is on multiple streaming services right now. So if you don't have one, maybe you have the other. You can stream it yourself if you don't have your own copy, which a lot of people do. I think this was one of the first big DVD releases. When they had I want to say when it was re-released on DVD, it was actually a pretty big seller. I don't know about Blu-ray or 4K, but of course it is available on those formats as well. But I mean, do you want to do just a quick summary in your own words of what the movie is about for anybody who
you're so much better at than I am, because I always leave holes. So why don't you do that?
No worries. Okay, so basically this movie, if you are not aware, and again, it's been out for 50 years, it's been a huge blockbuster, it's been on TV a billion times, every cable channel, every streaming service now. Basically, there's a small fishing village, tourist town on the beach up in Massachusetts called Amity. So basically, this small fishing village, also tourist town, is getting ready for their big 4th of July celebration. It's a huge time for tourists. It's a huge bit of income for the town as well, and extremely popular. But unfortunately, there's been a series of what appears to be shark-related murders. You have the new police chief, played by Roy Scheider, Brody, who is trying to do the right thing, but he's, of course, being pushed by the local town mayor and town council to keep this sort of shark business quiet. And after a couple deaths that could not be ignored, unfortunately, shark frenzy hits the town. And of course, they call in a oceanographic expert from the local university, Hooper, and there's also a experienced fishing captain and shark hunter, Quint. But after the shark has a couple more victims and it becomes very clear that they need to do something about this, Brody, Quint, and Hooper go out on the ocean themselves in Quint's boat, the Orca, in order to hunt and kill this giant shark. And it's a pretty fantastic movie. I think the balance is really good. The first part is all in the town and deals with that sort of growing unease and anxiety that comes with, well, when's the shark going to attack, who's going to be a victim, what's going to happen, and then the second half of the movie is, of course, on the water hunting the shark, and at the same time the shark is hunting them. So now, Bill, we talked about these characters, we talked about shark attacks, all of this stuff. And you said you read the book. What do you see as different between the movie and the book?
Well, a lot of it involves the interplay between the main characters. There's a subplot where the mafia wants to keep the property values up that makes no sense, but it's there. And it's really the mafia that's pressuring, even more than the mayor, that's pressuring Brody to keep the beaches open during the holidays. It's in terms of the main characters, the biggest difference is Hooper in that, well, Hooper and also Brody's wife, because Brody's wife in the book was actually from a different class from Brody. So she kind of married down, and one of her ex-beaux was Hooper's older brother. So when she meets Hooper, and it's kind of like by circumstance that when they called in this oceanographic expert from the university that it was Hooper, they begin an affair. None of that is in the movie. And then Hooper's ending is very different. I don't want to completely spoil it for people who haven't read the book, but it's very different.
Yeah.
You know, there's a different number of shark attacks. The shark attacks are a little different in the book. I will say, though, that for years and years and years, when I was asked, like, what was the first adult book I read, and I always went to this book called Birdie, which I think came out around 79, 80, and for some reason, I always discounted Jaws, you know? And also in the 70s, there was this big initiative called the Evelyn Wood Speed Reading Course, where you would read a book and you would and that was how I read Jaws initially. I kind of sped read it, you know, and it was a big book. I mean, it's not a small book. And it also is testimony to just the core story that the book of Jaws came out in 74. There were already bidding wars even before the book was released. Luckily, and when it was initially released, it was kind of a muted, reception. Good for a first book because it was Peter Benchley's first book, but it was a bit muted. But then they had the advent in the 70s, pretty much, of the Book of the Month clubs, and also the like the Columbia House, they would also have, a lot of publishers would have book clubs like that, where, you would start and get like 17 books for a cent, and then, astronomical
a book a month or something for $30.
And Jaws really benefited from that. So that it's amazing that the movie was being filmed as the book was becoming a phenomenon, which is really incredible when you think about it.
I mean, synergy right there. Clearly the publisher and the film studio, they saw what this could be, and they jumped on it as quickly as possible. And Peter Benchley, of course, the author. Interesting, talking about sort of the development of the book. He didn't know too much about sharks going into it. He had seen sharks. He had experienced swimming with sharks once and was like, this is really good. And, came up with the story, sold the book. And, of course, it was very, very much a hot commodity. And Steven Spielberg, who was the second choice to direct this movie, came on. He was only 28 years old at the time. And with Peter Benchley starting the first couple of drafts, I think he did the first 3 drafts of the film. Now he's this very different type of work from making a manuscript, that is, writing a film script. There were several other people who were brought on to finish this final script. They went to Martha's Vineyard. They found a beautiful location to do most of the shots, most of the big scenes in the town. They hired a lot of locals. Almost every single extra is a local from Martha's Vineyard, from the Cape, or from Boston. And in fact, when I was watching, a couple documentaries in preparation for this, one of the statistics that they threw out there was 8 people. 8 actors on screen are from Hollywood. Everybody else you see is a local. So they're either from Massachusetts or specifically from Martha's Vineyard, including a lot of people with dialogue. A lot of the extras who have, talking scene, most of that dialogue is improvised. It's just the people being themselves in this situation.
Yeah, and like you said, some of these are major supporting characters, like Alex Hinter's mother, that was a local actress. It really was
Deputy. The deputy was local.
But you also have they also had fun with the casting too, because one of the co-writers, Carl Gottlieb, who had a career before this, primarily is one of the head writers of the Smothers Brothers variety show. He has a role in it. Benchley has a role because Benchley's background was actually as a television reporter, and he plays a television reporter in the movie. But yeah, no, there's a lot of local actors and a lot of local non-actors.
Yes.
That got a chance.
I think that's the big thing there. It's that this is very much it's almost a hometown movie that happens to be the first blockbuster international blockbuster.
Yeah.
When it was finally.
You cannot stress enough what a watershed moment this was for films.
Right.
Because though even within the 70s, Jaws was coming off 3 very highly grossing films in The Exorcist, The Sting, and The Godfather, the first Godfather. Yeah. They made tons of money. But this one was a situation where they would start expanding the number of screens where it was on. So how we know wide release, how things were in the past was, very often, even big films would be open city by city.
Right.
This was different. It had a national release, but then it expanded that national release. So at least from the mid-70s, definitely codified by the early 80s, of our concept of a wide release is because of this film and because of the box office that it enjoyed. It really, Jaws really is, from a financial perspective, a definite before and after.
And I think with all the frustration that went into making this film, there were cost overruns. It took a long time to film. There was a lot of downtime because of weather or issues with the sets, with the boats. The boat sank a couple times before it was supposed to. And also good old Bruce himself, the mechanical shark that was built for this. And the interesting thing about Bruce, I did find out why he's named Bruce. He's named Bruce after Bruce Raymer, who is Spielberg's personal attorney. And apparently he just, for fun, started calling the shark Bruce, and it caught on with the rest of the crew. And so now that goes down that the shark will forever be Bruce, named after a lawyer, of course, a nice shark. But, there was so much concern here, and even Spielberg himself said, if this doesn't go well, this is it. Nobody's going to ask me to make a movie again. And, there was a lot of concern about that. But once the dailies started happening and once they started editing it down, they knew that they had a winner. Yep. And the release just proved that.
He basically locked Close Encounters of the Third Kind by the 4th week, I think, that Jaws was out.
Absolutely. So, and interestingly enough, so this did actually win a couple Oscars. It won 3. The first one for Best Film Editing, of course, for Verna Fields. Best Musical Score by John Williams. And, of course, we can't not mention and I can't really do the rest because it's copyright. But, is basically iconic. You can put that anywhere and people know.
Like the combination of 2 of the most recognized notes in the world.
Oh, yeah. So simple.
So simple. And it's also worth mentioning that it was nominated for Best Picture, but interestingly, Spielberg was not nominated for Best Director.
He was not. And, of course, it lost the Best Picture category to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest,
which swept the major categories. Yeah.
And the third one is actually for Best Sound Mixing, which I feel is very interesting because, and I mentioned this to you a little bit earlier, was that because you had so many locals there, non-actors, in many scenes, especially in the town crowd scenes, it feels natural. It's not documentary filmmaking, as
not at
you
all.
mentioned.
Not at all.
But it feels like this is what you would hear if you were standing in the middle of the town of Amity, or if you were sitting in the town hall. The kind of conversations you would hear, and everything's picked up. And it just sounds so real and so natural. And, you really feel immersed in this film. And I can, hardly imagine if you're in a huge movie theater, because I have not seen it on the big screen before. But if you're in a huge movie theater with loud sound, it feels like you are surrounded by this town. And then when you're out on the ocean, you're surrounded by water with one big, very toothy guy coming after you. Right. And it's just,
and I would say,
such a great
for me,
film.
The 2 scenes that really are, in terms of sound mixing and editing, are so powerful. The second beach scene, where everything goes to shit, and then the initial, actually the entire ride on the Orca.
Yeah.
It's just really, really effective, and kind of, I imagine, something that they do teach in film schools about how to make. Sometimes those the sound choices where there's very little, you know?
Yeah. Where it's very quiet, except for possibly those two notes very faintly in the background.
Or the sound of a wave, and that's broken by one of the actors' dialogue. Yeah, no, it's very effective from an audio standpoint and consistently.
Oh, yeah. And, kind of going back to the sound as a way to draw in, the viewer. On the Orca, there's a scene where the three of them, Hooper, Quint, and Brody, are sitting in the galley, and Hooper and Quint are kind of comparing scars. Also has a great little line of dialogue for Richard Dreyfuss there. He's like, I've got a real scar for you. And he opens up his shirt and he's like furry as hell. And you can faintly hear it from the background. Roy Scheider's Brody saying like, what, you're wearing a sweater? And that just to me was like, ooh, boy. But when Quint starts telling his story about the Indianapolis, which the USS Indianapolis, not a lot of people were familiar with that. They certainly were afterwards. And, in the intervening 50 years, they've done put out a lot more information about that. So the story isn't exactly all of these people died because of sharks, all these sailors that were in the water when the boat sank. But when Quint tells that, when the fabulous Robert Shaw, when he's telling the story, all the sound is just lowered, muted, except for his voice, and you feel as drawn in as the camera to his words. And he mumbles a lot. He has a lot of interesting ways of saying things and drawing out a pause or a sound. But you're just drawn into his story and drawn into just the sound of his voice before you get interrupted by a knock on the wall. And I think the sound for this is probably one of the big reasons why it's so successful as a horror movie, because it does things for you, not just the gore of, oh my gosh, people being eaten, a leg falling, after having been bit off onto the ocean floor. And because it is rated PG, and Spielberg did talk about this, they edited out a lot of additional violent deaths so that the MPAA wouldn't, rip it apart or make it an R-rated movie. There isn't a lot of gore, but what there is pretty gruesome. The shark isn't even seen for the first 30 minutes of the movie. Mm-hmm. And the sound really builds that tension early on. Yeah. When the shark finally gets seen, you have that, like just the fin out of the water, and the little hippie girl who's been painting on the dune, she just nervously, shark, just like that was fantastic. And, the sound for the rest of the movie, of course, the pounding of the engine as it starts to overheat and billow smoke, the, swelling of the music when Jaws comes out of the water multiple times and almost eats half of them. Hooper or Brody, when slipping off the side of the boat, things like this, just really, really fantastic.
And when you talk about the USS Indianapolis, I think it's important to note this. The two credited writers on the film are Peter Benchley and Carl Gottlieb. But other people contributed because the film was very much behind schedule. And the USS Indianapolis was actually written by the filmmaker John Milius, who was part of Spielberg's social circles, along with George Lucas and others, and Brian De Palma out in Los Angeles. And interestingly, if you find out about this, apparently, he delivered a very striking monologue, but a lot of that is also Robert Shaw cutting it down. And Shaw was an excellent writer himself. He wrote a wonderful play, The Man in the Glass Booth. He was an incredibly talented man. It's just one of those situations where, it's funny because, like, this is my third podcast in 3 nights talking about films. It comes to, sometimes you encounter something where it's a film that's made by committee. And in this case, it was real collaboration and not committee. And a lot of it out of necessity, a lot of it out of situations where they were planning to get shots and they weren't able to get shots because of the mechanic problems or the weather or for a bunch of reasons. It was not an easy shoot, and a lot of the documentaries go through this in very good detail. Yeah,
and actually, speaking of that, I did want to bring in this other little bit of trivia. Rodney Fox was one of the main consultants on the film for shark interaction in the water. He's one of the credited people for inventing the shark cage. He himself had been a victim of a shark attack, and in wanting to study these creatures closer and be able to do it more safely, they brought in the shark cage. And there, of course, is a major scene towards the end of the movie where Hooper himself is lowered into the shark cage to try and poison Bruce. But that is actually Rodney Fox in that cage. And interestingly enough, that scene was changed completely because of something that the shark, an actual real live shark, had done to the cage and the boat itself while filming. So the shark actually had slammed into the cage and pulled it along, also ripping off a huge chunk of the boat. And that caused the boat to start sinking. And of course, the filmmakers were freaking out at this point. They're like, oh my gosh, we're not going to get the shot right. It's not going to go right. They decided to leave that in. And that changed the fate of one of our main characters. What happens to the character because of what that shark did when interacting with Rodney Fox in the cage. So I thought that was pretty fantastic. He does do a much better job of explaining the situation than I did in the great documentary, How Jaws Changed the World. But I thought that was fascinating. The people that they used, you were talking about the filmmakers and these up-and-coming directorial and producing names that were part of the making of this film because they were Spielberg's friends. There's also a lot of early, shark-related researchers and people who went on to do a lot more work with, shark conservation, shark research, and promoting overall ocean awareness.
And that was
Peter and Wendy Benchley themselves are some of the biggest.
And a lot of that came out of guilt because after Jaws, there was a wave of shark hunting for sport, and to the point that there were many species that were actually endangered, and that goes on today. I mean, that still goes on today. But they, in terms of the eco balance in our oceans, they're incredibly important. You could tell if you ever saw an interview post 75 with Benchley, just how much that affected him, how guilty. And that was something, you could just feel bad about it, or you could do something about it, which was something that he and his wife and then later his children, who were still involved in some of those efforts. Yeah,
definitely. And the other consequence there, of course, was how the viewers, how spectators, people who saw Jaws, started feeling about swimming in the ocean, going to the shore. There were people who came out of that movie and were like, I'm never going in the water again. Never. As if sharks were just sitting off the coast, waiting for some yummy tourists to go swimming out to them. Which is not the case.
4 days after I saw the movie, I was going to a summer camp, Camp Scuffy in Tolman, New York. I wish there was more of an imprint online about Camp Scuffy because it was a wonderful place. But, we had paddle boats and canoes and things like that. And I would not get on the canoe. And I loved canoeing and kayaking. I loved it. I would not. I eventually, came to my senses. But that first time by a body of water,
yeah.
And it was, there were situations. There's a great interview with Bob Zombie, the musician, talking about after how he saw Jaws and he was honestly afraid to go to the bathroom because of the water in the toilet. Here I am in a landlocked Denny's and I'm actually afraid to go to the bathroom.
But yeah, I mean, the interesting thing too, so conservation was one result of this movie. Growing awareness of sharks and their importance to the ecosystem, especially in the ocean. But one of the other side effects of this was the imitators. Just the sheer number of ocean or body of water related monster fish or whatever.
This is my sweet spot. This is my sweet spot. Jawsploitation. This is my sweet spot. Because after Jaws, and it took a little bit of time, wasn't immediate, but throughout the late 70s, you had a bunch of movies. And Steve, do you mind if I just run off what I feel were the top 10? The first is a movie called Shark Kill, which is a TV movie in 1976, which was the first one that really kind of was, hitting the same buttons. Mako, The Jaws of Death, 1976. Orca in 1977. Tintorera. I always call this Tintorera, but it's called Tintorera. Killer Shark in 1977. Tentacles, which is about a big octopus, in 1977. The eventual sequel, Jaws 2, which I think is a very underrated film, in 1978. It does not reach the creative heights that this film does in any way, but it should be viewed on its own. But that I have a feeling it'll be another episode of the Bear Cave of Terror.
Absolutely.
Barracuda in 1978,
Ooh,
Piranha
Barracuda.
in 1978, Killer Fish in 1979, and then what is one of the absolute worst films of all time, Up from the Depths, 1979. Just got to give you a few. I know we're going to talk about Jawsploitation on another episode and maybe some of these films individually. In Up from the Depths, the creature looks different in every shot. At one point, it looks like it's clearly a shark. Another, it's almost like a catfish. And there's a part where a guy dies who was a shark hunter. And to lure the monster, I don't even think they even call it a shark. To lure it into this bay area, they tie his body to the back of the boat as a lure. And one of the people says, he would have wanted it this way. It is so bad. And then there's these scenes in the nightclub at the hotel where this stuff is happening. Oh, it is such a bad film. It's so bad. It's really, really bad. But I didn't see these movies until cable later, because a lot of these were rated R. You know, Jaws was PG. Jaws 2 was also PG. But a lot of these I didn't have access to until cable. I remember, even though I called it Tintorera Killer Shark, that one I really threw a tantrum with my parents. It's like, but there's no good movies to see. There's no other movies to see. I want to see Tintorera. And I didn't see it because I didn't see any R-rated movies until Up in Smoke, which is a whole other story.
That's a different kind of movie.
All the movies that I mentioned, apart from the first one, the TV movie Shark Kill, these were staples on cable.
Oh yeah,
in the 70s, and then on outlets like TBS and USA Network. And somebody may be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe that Jaws 2 was on cable before Jaws because of the constant reissues of the film. Yeah.
It's very likely. I know that personally I saw Jaws 3 when it was on USA Up All Night. So I remember seeing Jaws 3 on cable, but that was, in the 90s, like early 90s. One of the things with Jaws as well, I know that it did have an interesting broadcast history when it was broadcast on standard terrestrial stations. They added in several additional scenes. So in 1980-81, when it was broadcast on TV, it was actually, I think, about 15 minutes longer. And they had an additional scene, and I've been able to look them up. You can find them either on deleted scenes on DVD if you have it, or on YouTube if you need to. You've got Quint tormenting this poor kid playing a clarinet, just making fun of how terrible he is. You have Hooper talking with Brody in a much more extended scene where they're looking for the tiger shark that had been caught by the shark hunters earlier in the film so that they could dissect it. There's a long conversation about an ex of Hooper's that maybe ties in a little bit more with his character from the book.
I also believe that, correct me if I'm wrong, I do think that Hooper's autopsy of the tiger shark is much longer.
Yes.
I believe that's much longer. But they also did cut some scenes out because of the graphic nature of them.
I'm sure that the leg slowly falling was probably not included.
I do not remember that. Again, I'm a very old memory, but when the shark bite, I'm sorry for spoilers, but the film is 50 years old, okay? When Quint meets his end, that was very cut.
Yeah.
Because, there's parts where blood's coming out of his mouth and stuff. And from what I remember, that was much more sanitized.
Which is probably one of the reasons why they added so much other sort of more sanitary additional footage to it. Because they had to stretch it out to 3 hours long.
Well, also with that, with sometimes with these films, it gave them another hour of advertising time.
Absolutely.
And that was, when Superman the movie came out, it was actually like 4 hours long in a sense because of the extra footage. So that was not uncommon then, with at least with prestige films. There's also some other horrible stories. Like there's a Godzilla film when it aired on NBC was cut down to 45 minutes. There's the other side of it too. I did watch that broadcast, and one thing I definitely remember Quint's scene being really accelerated.
Right.
beyond being sanitized. Quint also in the book is a much darker character, much darker. He has like a dolphin cub that he illegally caught that they're going to use as bait. I mean, there's a lot more darkness to Quint in the book too. I think I should mention that. That's another character difference. Of the three characters, Brody is probably the most consistent. Also, with the description of Hooper, it sounds like he's like a hot preppy guy. I don't think you'd really say that about Dreyfuss. But I also think we really should talk about the actors.
Oh, yeah. So Roy Scheider was fantastic in this. I mean, he just did a great job being kind of the straight man. You know, knew this town, kind of a fish out of water.
Yeah, no pun intended, but yes, the fish out of water. Yeah.
He doesn't understand how the town works. So, of course, he's kind of steamrolled by the mayor pretty early on. And he doesn't really expect it to be as much of a problem as it is. Like, what are they going to do? Like, after the summer's over, everybody just kind of rolls up their sidewalks and they stay inside until next May. With Richard Dreyfuss, you know, I mentioned Wolf. This
really
version of Richard Dreyfuss, yeah, absolutely.
Oh,
especially when his hair is all curly. Like, because when you talk about the preppy moment, there's a preppy. There's a point where he tries to be preppy, where he combs his hair, he wears a suit when he goes to Brody's house, brings him a couple bottles of wine, but within about 15 minutes, he's changed out of the suit, he's in jeans, and his hair's all a curly mess again. And those glasses, I like those glasses on him.
One thing I will say, though, he has one line delivery which is perfect, and in real life was something I always wish I could have said. What are you, rich? Yeah.
And then, of course, Robert Shaw as Quint. And I can understand, because there are times when I'm watching it where I can't stand Quint. Because he just seems like he's this overconfident ass. Of course I'm going to catch the shark. Just give me some money, I'm going to kill it, and everybody be fine. You just need to listen to me. If you all listen to me, none of this would happen. There's parts where you're just kind of annoyed by him, but by the time they're all in the galley and he starts telling the USS Indianapolis story, you're back in. And also the kind of way that he torments Hooper, too. They're constantly at each other's throats. He's constantly joking about him, ragging on him. But then they do have that camaraderie towards the end, which feels earned.
Yeah. And we can safely say, given a play that's out there and a lot of passages in books about Jaws, that adversarial relationship definitely was fostered off screen.
Oh, yeah. He did not appreciate young up-and-comer Richard Dreyfuss. And Richard Dreyfuss just may not have shown him the respect maybe he should have deserved, being who he was.
Also, there's, in terms of the principal supporting characters, we have Lorraine Gary as Ellen Brody, who is Brody's wife, and Murray Hamilton as the mayor, who is kind of a buffoon. In the book, there's a lot more nuance to him. Actually, the shark attacks make him, even though he's an islander, make him decide to leave. So there's a lot more nuance to the character. And I think it's especially worth mentioning Lorraine Gary, Murray Hamilton, and Roy Scheider, because they are the only three actors from the film that do appear in the sequel, Jaws 2.
Yeah.
There's a Brody in the third film, which time-wise doesn't make sense, but there you go.
The third film doesn't make sense, but we can talk about that. I'm sure somebody loves it.
I did see it in 3D. It's not terrible. Jaws the Revenge is terrible. The fourth film is terrible.
I have read that novelization.
Of all the books to have read.
Don't know why. I do know why. It was at my grandparents' house. I went and spent a week there one summer when I was maybe 10, and they had that novelization. It was probably my uncle's, and so I read it because I was bored.
But in terms of novelizations, the Jaws 2 novelization is pretty much legendary for content that never made it to the film.
Interesting.
Including the motivation of the shark in Jaws 2. I've never read it. And I think maybe from our conversations and seeing this, I think I may be getting on that bandwagon.
I'm sure you can find it. It's one of those ththings that's available out there. But somewhere.
It wasn't uncommon, especially with films with cut scenes, that the novelization would be working from an early draft of the script. You know,
Right.
whether it's Star Wars or The Black Hole, I mean, a lot of the genre movies we love have additional content that was,
Right.
you know, at some point intended for the film and either not filmed or cut. I don't think Jaws 2 is quite that, given the perspective, but I really want to read that now. I really do.
Cool.
The more I read about it, it's something the more I want to experience it. Yeah. And I
But,
think this was also one of the things that set Jaws apart from horror movies, at least American horror movies,
Mhm.
apart from possibly The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby, in
Right.
that you had top-notch actors. Horror films were not known for that in the States. In England, it was a different story. You had a lot of stage actors, and there are some movies like The Wicker Man where it's the pedigree of the actors is just phenomenal. That wasn't really the case in the States.
So any final words on Jaws? You've expressed your love for this.
A couple of things. And this is something that has seemed to kept going and going. A couple of years on Broadway, I saw a show called The Shark is Broken about the making of Jaws, which details conversations that took place between Roy Scheider, Richard Dreyfuss, and Robert Shaw. The play is written by Ian Shaw, who is Richard Shaw's, and he also plays Robert Shaw. And when he first set on stage, like, there were gasps because it's fucking Quinn, you know. The play has had an amazing afterlife after its initial runs in the West End and on Broadway. It's had a U.S. tour. It's currently on a UK and Ireland tour, and I wouldn't be surprised if you see it again touring in the States. So if you have a chance to see it, and Jaws is a film you enjoy, I can almost guarantee you will enjoy this. It's a really good night of theater.
Awesome.
And then the other thing that I wanted to mention was, Steve, you mentioned that you saw a couple of documentaries about Jaws, and there's a lot. There's at least 3 major ones. They all take like 1 or 2 tones, one about the making of the film, the other about the effect of Jaws on the ecosystems and how shark hunting came in vogue. However, this year there was a Jaws at 50 documentary, which recently premiered on National Geographic and then hopped to Hulu, I think. And we didn't even get into theme park appearances of Jaws either, but only got so much time. And the movie Jaws at 50 documentary is very different because it covers other actors and other directors and writers and what Jaws meant to them and how they perceive the action that happened on there. And some were like way too young to have experienced this firsthand in the movie theater when it was first out. I thought that was a really nice change of pace instead of just having blinders on about the making of it. It's a very well done documentary.
You know, those were 2 of the documentaries that I watched in preparation for this episode, and we'll put them in the show notes. But I absolutely have to recommend Jaws at 50. I think it's great. You get to hear from the filmmakers themselves. You get to hear from people who love the movie. Emily Blunt is one of the people that gets to talk about how they felt about the movie, which is fun to hear because a lot of what she says is very similar to what most other regular moviegoers who have seen this movie and love this movie also say. So it's kind of a universal feel, universal reaction to such a pretty important horror movie, but it means a lot more to the wider Hollywood filmmaking enterprise as well as, you know, the history of film.
As a film watcher, what was your biggest scare in Jaws?
Biggest scare, to be honest, I think it's the famous scene where Roy Scheider is chumming the water and Bruce's head just pops out. And that moment is also tied with one of the funniest moments in the movie. Which is Roy Scheider's head popping up with the cigarette in his mouth and then backing slowly away with the famous line, "We're going to need a bigger boat."
Yeah. For me, the biggest scare. So there's, in the storyline of Jaws, there's actually a missing boat, which was one of the local fishermen, Ben Gardner.
Right.
And there's a point where you actually see Ben Gardner's fate. For me, I still jump. And I know it's coming, I still jump. And in terms of the tension, though, during the July 4th scene on the beach, spoilers, the shark doesn't actually go to the main beach, but actually in an area that they call the pond, but it's really like an estuary, like a lagoon. And the tension in that scene is like, I wish I had the perspective when I was 8 of really appreciating how great a filmmaker Spielberg was. Because a lot of that could have just been throwaway of just propelling the screen to say, hey, this is where the shark is. But he does amazing things with those few minutes. And it's not, for me, not the scariest bit, but it's the most suspenseful.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Zanowitz.
Well, thank you.
For talking Jaws with me.
I am very pleased. I don't know if I will end up being your first guest on the Bear Cave of Terror, but I'm your first recorded guest, and I enjoy that. And thank you, and I wish you all the success with this. And if you don't let me talk about Jawsploitation down the road, you're going to get hit in the face.
Yep. Yeah. I do know that will happen if I do not let you come back and talk about Jaws 2, Orca, possibly a couple other ones, Piranha maybe, I don't know. We'll see.
And there's others too. I mean, I just did this as a top 10. I mean, arguably there are films like Grizzly, which are Jaws-ish, and there's alligator films, which are Jaws-ish. Swamps and stuff, yeah. I know when we were talking about, you started throwing stuff with the Meg. For me, it all ends at 79. That's got to be the cutoff. Yeah.
Deep Blue Sea, Lake Placid.
To me, like, I'm not using Sharknado as an example of this, but by that time, the special effects had caught up to the storytelling that was in people's heads. And I don't know, for me, it's like, I like it where you can kind of see the tape and strings.
The tape, the strings, the clear stock footage that they've gotten. But cool. Well, thank you so much.
Well, my pleasure.